The earth trembled beneath the feet of thousands of people lined up in anticipation of the inevitable. The air was thick with dust kicked up by giant columns advancing toward each other in one of the most deserted spots in the ancient world. Two great empires, heirs to Alexander the Great, decided to settle their differences once and for all by pitting their best forces against each other on the battlefield. But on this day, the main protagonists were not men with spears and swords, but living mountains of muscle and fury. Dozens of battle elephants, clad in armor, advanced resembling unstoppable living fortresses capable of sweeping away any formation. These were the most powerful military machines of antiquity, on which kings and commanders pinned their hopes, confident in their crushing power. No one could have foreseen that this formidable weapon would cause one of the strangest disasters in the history of warfare. Instead of triumph and a demonstration of power, chaos ensued, which could not be controlled by any orders. The elephants, intended to crush the enemy, suddenly turned into an uncontrollable force, destroying everything in their path, including their own drivers. Panic spread through the ranks, and the great battle turned into a chaotic slaughter, where fear became the main enemy. This is the forgotten story of the Battle of Raphia, when natural tanks got out of control and changed the outcome of the war. Watch the video to the end to find out how one biological feature of elephants cost the empire an entire province. What if I told you that the fate of the entire Middle East was decided by the ambitions of two young men who had barely ascended to the throne? In 217 BC, the world was divided between the Diadochi, the descendants of Alexander the Great's generals, who had turned his empire into a patchwork of warring states. Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemies, the richest dynasty, which controlled grain and trade, but was mired in palace intrigues and luxury. In the east, the Seleucid Empire was gaining strength, a huge and aggressive power, seeking to restore the borders of Alexander's time. Conflict between them was inevitable, as both powers laid claim to the strategically important region of Syria, the territory of modern Lebanon and Israel. For Ptolemy the Fourth Philopator, this was a test of strength, as he was considered a weak ruler, more interested in art than war. His rival Antiochus III, later called the Great, was young, energetic, and hungry for military glory, dreaming of uniting the entire Hellenistic world under his rule. Antiochus began the Fourth Syrian War rapidly, capturing city after city and pushing the Egyptian garrisons back to the borders of Egypt itself. It seemed that the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty was only a matter of time, and the ancient land of the pharaohs would soon change hands. However, Ptolemy's advisors, realizing the mortal danger, began feverish preparations for the decisive battle, buying time with diplomatic tricks. In Alexandria, the capital of the world in luxury, an unprecedented mobilization began, affecting all strata of the population and emptying the treasury. Mercenaries from all over the Mediterranean, Greeks, Thracians, Galatians, flocked to Egypt, attracted by the gold of the Ptolemies and the promise of rich spoils. But the main innovation was the decision to arm and train native Egyptians in phalanx combat, something that Macedonian rulers had previously avoided for fear of uprisings. It took months to prepare the army, during which blacksmiths forged thousands of sarissas and instructors drilled recruits under the scorching sun. It was not just an army, but a complex mechanism assembled from dozens of peoples speaking different languages but united by a common goal. Antiochus, confident in his superiority, allowed the Egyptians to gather their forces, which was his first but not his last mistake in this campaign. Both armies were enormous in size for that time, about 70,000 men for Ptolemy and slightly fewer for Antiochus. It was a clash that would determine the hegemony of the Eastern Mediterranean for decades to come. The stakes were so high that defeat meant not only the loss of territory, but the possible collapse of the entire dynasty. The meeting place was Raphia, a small town on the border between Egypt and Palestine, surrounded by sand dunes and wastelands. It was here, far from the big cities, that the two giant armies were to meet in a deadly confrontation. The commanders placed their pieces on the chessboard of the desert, preparing for a game where the price of a mistake was thousands of lives. The atmosphere in the camps was tense, with soldiers cleaning their weapons and praying to their gods, knowing that many of them would not live to see the sunset. But the main trump card up the sleeves of both kings was not the infantry or cavalry, but special units that inspired awe with their mere appearance. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about the role of personality in history? Could a more experienced ruler have avoided this massacre? Write about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on analyses of other great battles. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the most terrifying military machine looked like before the invention of gunpowder? The Hellenistic armies of that time represented the pinnacle of military art, combining heavy infantry, maneuverable cavalry, and light archers. The basis of their battle formation was the Macedonian phalanx, a forest of long pikes called sarissas, capable of stopping any attack and crushing the enemy in a head-on collision. Phalanx soldiers were clad in bronze helmets and linen armor, and their shields hung around their necks, freeing their hands to hold heavy spears. The wall of spearheads protruding several meters forward was impenetrable to the enemy's swords and short spears. But the phalanx was slow and vulnerable on the flanks, so it needed the reliable protection of cavalry and light infantry. Antiochus brought with him elite units of silver shields, veterans of many campaigns who were considered the best infantry in Asia. His cavalry consisted of armored cataphracts and fast-mounted archers, capable of showering the enemy with arrows and immediately retreating. It was an army of conquerors accustomed to victory and confident in its tactical superiority over the effeminate Egyptians. Ptolemy, on the other hand, relied on numbers and diversity, gathering mercenaries from all corners of the known world under his banners. Libyan chariots, Cretan archers, Thracian peltasts with their curved swords. It was a veritable Babylonian rabble, transformed by drill into a unified force. But the riskiest move was the inclusion in the phalanx of 20,000 native Egyptians, the Mahims, who were handling Macedonian weapons for the first time. Elephants occupied a special place in the armies, serving in that era as the equivalent of modern tanks and a means of psychological intimidation. The use of these animals required complex logistics, enormous amounts of feed, and specially trained mahouts. An elephant on the battlefield was expensive, capricious, but potentially decisive, capable of breaking through any formation. Kings spent fabulous sums on maintaining elephant corps, building special stables for them and stockpiling tons of provisions. The animals were trained to the noise of battle, the clang of metal, and the cries of people so that they would not be frightened at the most crucial moment. Their tusks were often shackled with metal, and wooden towers were placed on their backs, in which archers and spear throwers sat. The presence of elephants was considered an indicator of the status and power of a state, a kind of nuclear weapon of the ancient world. The Seleucids had access to Indian elephants through their eastern provinces and trade routes, which gave them a strategic advantage. The Ptolemies, on the other hand, were cut off from India and had to rely on another source of living machines, which would play a fateful role. Engineers and tacticians on both sides racked their brains over how to use these giants effectively and how to defend against them. Special boards with spikes, flaming arrows, and hooks were developed to combat elephants, but no theoretical calculations could prepare the armies for what would happen in reality when the beasts clashed in close combat. The anticipation of battle turned into a contest of nerves and resources, where every day of delay cost a fortune. Both sides understood that the clash of elephants would be the culmination of the battle, the moment of truth for their military doctrines. In the next chapter, we will examine the main secret that determined the outcome of the clash of the giants. What single factor could render the perfect weapon completely useless against its counterpart? Guess how long it took historians to understand the real reason for this curious event? For a long time, it was believed that Ptolemy's elephants were simply frightened because they were poorly trained or their drivers were less experienced. But the truth lies in biology and geography, about which ancient commanders had only a vague idea based on myths. Antiochus III brought 102 Indian elephants to the battlefield, massive animals that had been used in wars in the East for centuries. These were large, powerful beasts, reaching 3 meters or more at the shoulder, with enormous physical strength. They were veterans accustomed to the smell of war and obedience to humans, true giants among animals. Ptolemy had 73 elephants, but they were not Indian giants, but their African relatives. It is important to understand that we are not talking about the famous savanna elephants, the largest land mammals, but about a now almost extinct subspecies, North African forest elephants. These animals were significantly smaller than their Indian counterparts, inferior to them in height, weight, and tusk length. The difference in size was obvious even to the naked eye. The Indian elephant towered over the African elephant like a tower over a hut. The backs of Ptolemaic elephants barely reached the shoulders of the Seleucid giants, which put them at a distinct disadvantage. In addition, the towers on the backs of African elephants were smaller and could accommodate fewer archers, reducing their firepower. But the most important factor was not size, but instinctive fear, inherent in nature. The ancient historian Polybius wrote that African elephants cannot stand the smell and voice of Indian elephants. This biological barrier, a kind of species incompatibility, proved stronger than any training or orders from the Mahouts. Ptolemaic commanders were probably aware of this problem, but hoped that the fighting spirit and skill of the drivers would compensate for the animals' natural instincts. They planned to use the elephants to intimidate the cavalry and break through enemy lines rather than to duel with other elephants. It was a gamble that often led to tragedy in ancient warfare. Ptolemy's elephants were captured in the area of modern-day Eritrea and Sudan, and their delivery to Egypt was a logistical feat. They were trained with particular care in an attempt to instill aggression and fearlessness in them. But no amount of training could change the animal's genetics and innate reactions to an unfamiliar and stronger predator. The Seleucids, on the other hand, were confident in their animals, knowing that the Indian elephant was the king of beasts on the battlefield. They deliberately pitted their giants against Ptolemy's elephants, counting on an easy victory and psychological defeat of their enemy. It was a cold-blooded exploitation of an advantage granted by nature itself. Thus, even before the battle began, the fate of the elephant confrontation was predetermined by biology. Two different species, meeting thousands of kilometers from their native lands, were to engage in a battle whose outcome was clear only to the animals, but not to humans. Human self-confidence collided with the laws of nature, and nature was preparing to teach a cruel lesson. If you like learning such unique historical details, like this video right now. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how this madness began? Early in the morning of the decisive day, when the sun had just begun to heat the sand, both armies left their fortified camps. They began a slow and difficult deployment on the wide flat plain in front of the ancient city of Raphia. It was not a quick process, but a long and solemn ritual that took several hours of grueling waiting. Everything took place amid the incessant roar of trumpets, the beating of heavy drums, and the hoarse shouts of commanders trying to be heard above the steppe wind. Kings Ptolemy and Antiochus, both clad in shining ceremonial armor, personally rode around their huge armies. They addressed the soldiers with fiery and inspiring speeches, trying to raise morale before death. In their proclamations, the monarchs generously promised rewards, reminded them of the great glory of their ancestors, and emphasized the importance of the upcoming victory for the future of their families and children. However, as historians later pointed out, the ordinary soldiers in the huge crowd could hardly hear the voices of their kings. The noise of thousands of people and animals drowned out their words, and the rank and file relied more on the familiar orders of their immediate commanders. For most, it was just a colorful show before the bloody work began. At the center of both armies, like a steel spine, stood the indestructible Greek-Macedonian phalanxes. It was a veritable forest of long spears, sarissas, stretching beyond the horizon and glistening in the sun with bronze and iron. The warriors stood so close together that the phalanx seemed like a single creature covered in scales of armor. On the flanks were fast cavalry and light infantry, called upon to cover the vulnerable sides of this unwieldy heavy formation. But on this morning, all eyes, full of fear and admiration, were fixed on the front line. There, raising clouds of dust, stood the living tanks of the ancient world, war elephants. It was they who were to deliver the first most terrible blow and crush the enemy's ranks. The Seleucid king Antiochus concentrated most of his elephants, more than 60, on his right flank. He positioned them opposite the left flank of Ptolemy's Egyptian army, preparing for a decisive breakthrough here. Antiochus planned to deliver a crushing blow here, using his overwhelming advantage in the quality and quantity of animals. The rest of the elephants were distributed to support other sections of the front, but the main armored fist was assembled here. Ptolemy, alarmed by the enemy's preparations, deployed his 40 elephants opposite Antiochus's strike force. He hoped to at least temporarily hold back this monstrous onslaught and give his infantry time. He sent the remaining 33 elephants to his right flank to support the attack of his own cavalry. Thus, the main stage for the Duel of the Giants was set on the left flank of the Egyptian army. The air above the plain was literally electrified with tension and anticipation of the imminent slaughter. The horses nervously chewed their bits and snorted, sensing the frightening presence of the huge beasts and their distinctive smell. The elephants, richly decorated with purple blankets and tall plumes of ostrich feathers, shifted from foot to foot, uttering a dull, guttural grunt. The drivers, sitting on the necks of the giants, checked the fastenings of the battle towers on the animals' backs one last time. They laid out darts and long spears, preparing for a deadly carousel several meters above the ground. Each of them knew that falling down would mean certain death underfoot. For a brief moment, a heavy, ringing silence hung between the two giant armies. It was broken only by the clanging of weapons, gusts of wind, and the loud snorting of animals. It was that very eerie moment when history stood still, choosing the path it would take next. Every soldier, from the lowliest mercenary to the most noble officer, understood a simple truth. By evening, many of those standing nearby would be dead, and the yellow sand of the desert would be red with blood. The commanders gave their final orders, and mounted couriers galloped off to deliver them to distant units. The huge human mechanisms shook and began to move, preparing for the clash. Ptolemy took his place on the left flank, right next to his elephants, bravely deciding to personally lead the defense. Antiochus stood at the head of his elite cavalry on the right, preparing for a swift and decisive attack. The strategy of both kings was classic for the military art of the time. They planned to deliver a powerful blow with cavalry and elephants on the flank in order to encircle and destroy the enemy's center. But neither of the great strategists fully took into account the unpredictability of animal behavior in stressful situations. How do you think a man standing in the front row of the phalanx feels when 100 enraged elephants are staring at him? The signal to attack, sounded by a sharp blast of a trumpet, broke the silence, and thousands of throats simultaneously let out a battle cry. The earth literally shook as Antiochus's huge Indian elephants moved forward. They began to accelerate, gathering speed and turning into an inexorable gray avalanche, sweeping away everything in their path. Dust rose in a high wall, obscuring the sun and turning the battlefield into a surreal, gloomy landscape. Ptolemy's elephants, urged on by the shouts and blows of their mahouts, also moved toward the enemy. But their movements were much less confident, and their formation was ragged. The fact was that Ptolemy had African forest elephants, which were smaller and weaker than their Indian counterparts. As they approached, the animals began to show signs of great anxiety, sensing the unfamiliar, frightening smell coming from the approaching gray wall. The mahouts desperately prodded them with sharp hooks behind their ears, trying to force them forward to certain death. But nature took its toll. African elephants instinctively feared the larger males of the enemy. However, discipline and the pain from the hooks forced them into this hopeless battle. The collision of the two living walls was terrifying in its power and ferocity. The sound of flesh hitting flesh, the crack of breaking tusks, and the roar of pain drowned out the general noise of battle. Antiochus' Indian elephants, making the most of their advantage in mass and height, literally knocked their African opponents off their feet. They pushed them with their foreheads, struck them in the sides with their tusks, and knocked them to the ground like giant toys. In the wooden towers mounted on the animals' backs, a separate, fierce battle was taking place. Archers and spearmen showered each other with projectiles from a distance of only a few meters. People struck by arrows fell from a great height directly at the feet of the raging giants, instantly disappearing under their heavy feet. It was a chaotic war in 3 dimensions, where death could come from any direction, above or below. Elephants locked tusks in a deadly clinch, trying to break their opponents' necks or knock them to the ground with their sheer weight. The Indian giants easily dominated this battle of strength, pushing the Africans back step by step. Ptolemy's animals retreated straight into the ranks of their own infantry, breaking the formation of their own defenders. For the elephants of the Egyptian army, it was a deliberately unequal battle, and they understood this perfectly well, succumbing more and more to panic. The spectacle of this battle was both majestic in its power and repulsive in its cruelty. Huge animals, maddened by pain, wounds, and rage, turned the space around them into a zone of total destruction. Wooden towers were shattered by blows, leather harnesses were torn, and control over the beast was rapidly being lost. The drivers were no longer controlling the battle, but were merely trying to stay on the backs of their pets. The Egyptian infantry, standing behind their elephants, watched what was happening with growing horror. They saw their living shield, on which they had pinned so many hopes, begin to retreat straight toward them. The soldiers understood with frightening clarity that if the elephants ran, there would be nowhere to run. They would simply be trampled by their own beasts. Hope for victory was rapidly replaced by cold horror at the impending catastrophe. Antiochus, delighted to see the complete success of his elephants on the right flank, ordered the cavalry to increase the pressure. He sought to build on his success and finally defeat the enemy while they were still in confusion. His plan worked perfectly. The left flank of the Egyptians began to bend dangerously and creak under the monstrous pressure. It seemed that the battle was practically won in the first minutes of the battle, and victory was in the bag for the Seleucids. But at this critical moment, the thing that all experienced elephant drivers feared most happened. The animal's natural instinct for self-preservation took precedence over years of training and discipline. The controlled force finally spiraled out of control and turned into uncontrollable chaos. The drama on the left flank reached its bloody climax, but this was only the beginning of the real tragedy. Here is an expanded version of the text. The volume has been increased by about 2 times, the structure with questions and hooks has been preserved, and brackets and lists have been removed. The text is broken down into short paragraphs for ease of narration. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries as an example of animal cruelty, but at the time, it was the harsh reality of war. Ptolemy's elephants, unable to withstand the monstrous onslaught and the pungent smell of larger males, broke down psychologically. Nature prevailed over years of persistent training, and the giant beast fell into a state of uncontrollable madness. Animal fear proved stronger than any commands shouted at them by the people on their backs. They no longer obeyed the orders of their drivers, completely ignoring the painful blows of the hooks and the furious shouts. Their only desire was to run as far away as possible from the source of their primal terror. Turning around, the multi-ton animals, driven mad by panic, rushed to the only free side. Unfortunately for the Egyptians, this direction led straight to the orderly ranks of their own infantry and cavalry. The natural tanks began to crush their own soldiers, cutting wide, bloody sways through the dense formation. People simply did not have time to run away from the giants rushing towards them. The cries of soldiers caught under the heavy feet of the beasts mingled with the trumpeting of the elephants, creating a veritable cacophony of hell. Ptolemy's elite royal guard, standing on the left flank, found themselves in a deadly trap with no chance of escape. These warriors were the best of the best, but their swords were useless against such a threat. In front of them, Antiochus's triumphant troops pressed forward, already tasting the sweet taste of imminent victory. Behind and to the sides, they were methodically trampled by their own war elephants, which were impossible to dodge in the dense crowd. The formation, which had been trained for years to be a monolith, fell apart instantly. The soldiers, in horror, threw down their now useless weapons and tried to flee. But in the confusion and thick clouds of dust, they only fell under the hooves of the enemy cavalry. Antiochus's horsemen mercilessly finished off the survivors, allowing no one to escape. The chaos was complete and absolute. No one listened to their commander's orders anymore. Control of the troops on this section of the front was lost forever. Ptolemy IV, who was in the thick of these tragic events, only miraculously escaped a foolish and absurd death. His own elephant was wounded and refused to obey, and death reigned all around. The pharaoh's personal guard was almost completely wiped out in this bloody melee. The king found himself virtually alone in the midst of total defeat, cut off from the main forces of his army. He was in real danger of being trampled or speared by a common soldier. He had to flee hastily to avoid being taken prisoner by the enemy. He understood that for the ruler of Egypt, Capture would be an indelible disgrace. It would mean the end of his dynasty and the collapse of the entire state. Antiochus, seeing the panic of the enemy and the flight of their leader, openly rejoiced. It seemed to him that the battle was already won and that history would remember him as a great commander. He decided to personally lead the pursuit of the fleeing enemy, wanting to destroy them once and for all. The young king led his elite cavalry further and further away from the main battlefield. He was so carried away by the chase that he stopped paying attention to what was happening behind him. In the heat of excitement and thirst for blood, he forgot the main rule of any wise commander. Never lose control of the overall picture of the battle for the sake of momentary local success. His long absence from the main battlefield would soon prove fatal for his entire army. While the left flank of the Egyptians was being mercilessly destroyed by their own elephants and Antiochus's cavalry, the situation was different at the other end of the field. Ptolemy's right flank, where the elephants refused to engage in battle at all, acted more cautiously. There, the animals simply froze, but did not attack their own men. The commanders of the Egyptian cavalry in this section quickly assessed the situation and made the right decision. They decided to simply bypass the frozen elephants without trying to force them to move forward. This maneuver allowed them to maintain their formation and attack the enemy from the flank. However, the panic of the elephants on the left flank became contagious, like a dangerous disease. Seeing the flight of the huge beasts and the defeat of the elite units, many mercenaries decided that the battle was already lost. Fear began to spread through the ranks of the army faster than the commands of the commanders. They began to retreat without waiting for an official order, afraid of being the last ones left on the battlefield. It seemed that Ptolemy's great army was falling apart before their very eyes, like a house of cards in the wind. Even Antiochus's elephants, having broken through the enemy's ranks, became completely uncontrollable from excitement and the smell of blood. Left without worthy opponents, they wandered aimlessly across the field, attacking anything that moved. The battle turned into a series of brutal local skirmishes where everyone fought for their own lives. The commander's overall plan ceased to exist in this chaos of dust, screams, and the clang of metal. The disaster on the left flank seemed fatal for the Egyptians, and many had already mentally buried Ptolemy. But the fate of great battles is often decided not on the flanks, but in the center, where the infantry stands. And there, amid clouds of dust and the heavy smell of blood, an event was brewing that would change the course of history. Do you think it is possible to stop the panic of an entire army with one successful maneuver? Antiochus III was absolutely confident in his military genius and complete, unconditional victory. He saw the backs of the fleeing Egyptian soldiers and drove his horse forward, anticipating a great triumph. His cavalry pursued Ptolemy's defeated left flank for several kilometers, moving further and further away from the city of Raphia. The horsemen were carried away by the easy slaughter and capture of rich prisoners, forgetting everything else in the world. It seemed to them that the war was already over and it was time to collect trophies. The young and ambitious king believed that the battle had already been won and the job was done. In his eyes, the defeat of one flank automatically meant the surrender of the entire enemy army. He was so intoxicated by his quick success that he made an unforgivable mistake. He did not notice that he had left his own infantry phalanx completely unprotected by cavalry. A huge mass of infantry remained vulnerable on the flanks, but Antiochus did not see this. Meanwhile, Ptolemy, having struggled to escape the chaos on the left flank, did something that saved his crown. Instead of fleeing the battlefield for Alexandria, as many of his courtiers expected, he turned his horse around. Risking his life, the king made his way to the center of his army, where a huge phalanx of foot soldiers stood. These thousands of soldiers had not yet entered the battle and were anxiously watching the clouds of dust. The sudden appearance of the ruler before his soldiers, without his retinue, but alive and determined, had the effect of an exploding bomb. The soldiers saw their king, who had not abandoned them in their hour of need, but had come to share their fate. This instantly raised the morale of the troops, which a minute ago had been practically zero. The people understood that their leader was ready to die with them on this sand. The Makims, simple Egyptian spearmen who had been allowed into the phalanx for the first time, were particularly inspired. For them, it was a moment of national pride and an opportunity to prove their valor. They struck their heavy shields against their long spears, greeting the pharaoh with a thunderous roar. The sound, like a roll of thunder, rolled across the battlefield. On the opposite side of the field, the Seleucid phalanx was left without supreme command and supervision. Antiochus was chasing fugitives somewhere far away in the desert, and his infantry simply stood waiting for orders. Antiochus' commanders did not know what to do, attack or wait for the king's return. They saw their king gallop victoriously into the distance, and also unwittingly relaxed. The soldiers lowered their heavy spears, expecting the enemy to surrender quickly and the battle to end. Discipline in the ranks began to falter, as no one expected serious resistance. Ptolemy took advantage of this confusion among the enemy and personally ordered his phalanx to advance. A huge mass of people, bristling with thousands of sharp sarissas, moved forward slowly and menacingly. The Egyptians, whom Antiochus and his generals arrogantly despised as warriors, attacked with incredible fury. They understood that they were defending their native land, their homes, and their families from foreign invaders. The Egyptian phalanx's strike was terrifying in its power and primitive onslaught. Deprived of the support of elephants and fast cavalry, Antiochus's infantry found themselves face to face with superior enemy forces. They were caught off guard and simply did not have time to properly regroup for a solid defense. A brutal melee ensued, with long spears deciding the outcome of the battle even before the fighters closed in. The clang of metal and the cries of the dying filled the air in the center of the field. The Seleucid infantry, rightly considered the best in the world, began to retreat under the pressure of the inspired Egyptians. Antiochus's mistake became a textbook example of how a tactical victory can turn into a strategic defeat. Carried away by the pursuit of easy prey and glory, he lost control of the main forces of his army. When he finally returned to the battlefield, it was too late to do anything about it. His army was defeated, and victory slipped through his fingers for good. In the center of the battlefield, a drama was unfolding that the young, self-confident conqueror did not even suspect. Greek discipline clashed with Egyptian fury, and the result surprised everyone. For the first time in centuries, the indigenous Egyptians felt like masters of the battlefield. 20,000 Mahems, who had been trained and armed according to the Macedonian model, proved to be an incredibly formidable force. It was a huge mass of people, united by a single impulse and desire to defend their land. Their phalanx was much denser and more numerous than the Seleucid troops, who were tired from the heat and long wait. The Egyptians were full of fresh strength and determination, while the enemy was already beginning to lose patience. The Egyptian sarissas, long and heavy spears, pierced the enemy's armor with frightening efficiency. The wall of shields slowly but surely pushed back the Seleucid infantry, giving them no chance to regroup. The Egyptians pressed forward with their mass, step by step reclaiming the desert space from the invaders. Ptolemy, standing in the front ranks among his soldiers, inspired them with his personal example and presence. This was extremely rare for Hellenistic monarchs of that time, who usually watched the battle from afar. Despite their vast experience and elite status as silver shields, the Seleucid phalanx began to retreat uncertainly. They found themselves caught in a vice of circumstances for which they were unprepared. On one side, they were pressured by the enraged Egyptians, and on the other, their own panic grew as they realized that the cavalry had abandoned them. The soldiers felt betrayed by their king, who had disappeared in an unknown direction. Their formation began to break down, and discipline melted away with every passing second. The situation was finally decided by the Egyptian cavalry on the right flank, which miraculously avoided a clash with the elephants at the beginning of the battle. The cavalry commanders quickly got their bearings and struck at the unprotected flank of Antiochus's infantry. This was the final nail in the coffin of the Seleucid army, which was already fighting with its last ounce of strength. Surrounded on all sides and pinned to the ground, the best soldiers in Asia lost the will to resist. They began to surrender en masse or try to flee, abandoning their comrades. The Mahima, sensing the sweet taste of victory, fought with redoubled, almost superhuman energy. For them, this was not just another battle for their king or their pay, but proof of their own importance. They, whom the Greek elite had considered for centuries to be nothing more than a labor force, were now crushing the best troops of the Hellenistic world. Their eyes burned with a fire of national pride that could not be extinguished. They proved to everyone that they were as capable of wielding weapons as the Macedonians. Thick dust and the deafening noise of battle reliably hid the scale of the disaster from Antiochus's eyes. He was still somewhere far away in the desert, reveling in his imagined victory on the flank, when the breathless messengers finally reached him with the news of the complete defeat of the center. It was too late to change anything. The time had been irretrievably lost, and it was impossible to correct the king's mistake. By that time, the Seleucid phalanx had been almost completely destroyed or scattered. Thousands of soldiers lay dead on the hot sand, and even more people threw down their weapons in terror. Antiochus's pride and ambitions were trampled into the dust by simple Egyptian sandals. The battlefield he considered his own had turned into a graveyard for his hopes. It was a true triumph of simple infantry over formidable elephants and swift cavalry. Iron discipline and numerical superiority defeated the technical equipment and individual skill of the mercenaries. Ptolemy, whom all his neighbors and even his own advisors considered a weak ruler, had achieved the impossible. He had won the greatest victory of his dynasty and secured his throne. Antiochus returned to the battlefield, expecting to see his soldiers finishing off the remnants of Ptolemy's army. In his imagination, he was already accepting the surrender and preparing for a triumphant entry into Alexandria. Instead, he saw a horrific scene of complete and utter defeat. His camp was in imminent danger of being captured by looters. The pitiful remnants of his once great army fled in panic toward the city of Raphia. The realization of what had happened hit him harder than any enemy weapon. He had won on his section of the front. His elephants had indeed crushed the enemy, but he had lost the entire battle. His grandiose ambitions were shattered by his own youthful recklessness and impetuosity. He realized that tactical success was worthless if the strategy had been lost. It was a cruel lesson, paid for with thousands of lives. He tried to gather the scattered remnants of his troops to organize a defense, but the panic was already widespread and uncontrollable, like a forest fire. No one listened to the king's orders. Everyone was only thinking about saving their own skin. The great king, the conqueror of Asia, had to join the shameful retreat. He had to hurry to save at least his own life and freedom. Ptolemy, showing wisdom, did not pursue the enemy too far into hostile territory. He was quite satisfied that he had preserved his kingdom and defended its borders. His army, incredibly tired and badly battered in battle, celebrated its victory right on the battlefield. The soldiers rejoiced amid mountains of human corpses and huge carcasses of dead elephants. The air was filled with the smell of blood and the joyful cries of the victors. The losses that day were truly enormous for both sides, but especially for the losers. Antiochus lost about 10,000 infantrymen killed and captured, as well as all of his war elephants. Some of the giants died in battle, while others were captured by the Egyptians as valuable trophies. Ptolemy lost fewer men, but almost all of his elephants on the left flank were destroyed at the beginning of the battle. This battle clearly demonstrated one important truth to all the commanders of the time. Elephants, for all their outward power and fearsome appearance, are extremely unreliable weapons. They could win a local skirmish, but just as easily lose a battle by sowing chaos in their own ranks. The era of the unconditional dominance of war elephants was coming to an end. On the evening of that terrible day, the desert was filled with the quiet moans of the wounded and the loud cries of triumph from the victors. History took a sharp turn, preserving Egypt as an independent state for another 2 centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty received a reprieve from its inevitable fall, but this great victory had a hidden price that the Ptolemies had yet to pay. The Battle of Raphia was not only a grand military clash, but also a major political milestone of the era. Egypt managed to retain control over the disputed lands of Syria, which were so necessary for both empires. Antiochus III, having received a harsh rebuff, was forced to temper his excessive ambitions for a time. He had to retreat and deal with problems within his vast state. But the most important and profound consequence was the change in the self-awareness of ordinary Egyptians. The Mahimas, Egyptian veterans of Raphia, returned home to their villages as true heroes. They carried with them new knowledge that was dangerous to the authorities. They realized on the battlefield that they could fight on equal terms with the Greeks and Macedonians. The myth of the invincibility of Hellenistic warriors was shattered in their eyes forever. They saw that the blood of the invaders was the same color as theirs. This insight led to a sharp and rapid rise in nationalism among the local population. In the following decades, the country was shaken by a series of powerful and violent popular uprisings. The people who had learned to maintain order and kill their enemies no longer wanted to be second-class citizens. They demanded respect and rights on their own land. The Ptolemaic Empire faced an enemy that it had trained itself. The dynasty that had been saved by Egyptian spears on that hot day began to slowly crumble from within. The power of the Greek-born pharaohs wavered under pressure from those they had rashly armed. The victory at Raphia, which seemed like salvation, actually planted a time bomb under the throne. This mechanism had been set in motion, and it was already impossible to stop it. The Ptolemies won the battle but began to lose the war for the loyalty of their subjects. As for war elephants, their role in warfare after this battle began to be seriously reconsidered. Commanders and kings realized that the risk of using these giant animals often outweighed the real benefits. It became clear that at a critical moment, the animals could be more dangerous to their own side than to the enemy. Natural tanks still remained in the armies, but the attitude towards them became much more cautious and skeptical. Blind faith in their crushing power was a thing of the past. The fate of the animals themselves was even more tragic. The unique African forest elephants used by the Ptolemies soon disappeared from the maps of military operations, and then they became extinct as a species, unable to withstand competition from civilization. They fell victim to endless human ambition, hunting, and climate change. Their tragedy and panic at Raphia marked the beginning of the end of their existence on Earth. Raphia has remained in world history as an eternal and grim example for posterity. It showed that war is always unpredictable chaos that cannot be completely controlled. No brilliant plan can withstand the reality of panic and fear, and even the most powerful weapons of destruction can suddenly turn against their own creators. The history of the Battle of Raphia teaches us that technological superiority is no guarantee of victory. Elephants, those ancient tanks, turned out to be a colossus with feet of clay, destroying the plans of great strategists. The human factor, the courage of ordinary soldiers, and the ability of a leader to admit mistakes and return to the fray proved more important than brute force. Ptolemy IV, who was considered weak, was able to retain power, while Antiochus the Great learned a harsh lesson that made him wiser. But the real heroes and victims of this war were those whose names were not preserved in the annals. Ordinary Egyptian spearmen and unfortunate animals sacrificed to human pride. What struck you most about this story? The biological miscalculation with the elephant species, or the fatal mistake of Antiochus, who got carried away with the chase? Write your opinion in the comments. It is important for us to know what you think. And be sure to subscribe to the channel to discover forgotten pages of history with us.